Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Measuring Performance, the Key to Connecting Collaboration. I'm Julie Gallagher, Senior Content Manager for Supermarket News, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. We're excited to have you join us for the final webinar in this Best Practice series. Before we get started, let me point out a few quick tips on how to make the most of today's webinar. If you're experiencing technical difficulty, let us know through the Q&A box or by troubleshooting through the Help widget. Some common problems, such as the loss of sound and/or a stall in the slides, may be resolved by a quick refresh of your browser. Please make sure to turn off any content blockers so you can utilize all the widgets on the console. If you have a question for one of our speakers, you can submit it via the Q&A box. We will try to address all questions during the panel discussion, but we'll answer any question that we don't get to via email at the conclusion of the webinar. Today's slides will be sent to all webinar attendees as part of a thank you email. Don't forget to share today's webinar by clicking the Twitter or LinkedIn buttons at the bottom of your screen. You can also tweet during or after the webinar. There's a Twitter widget on the left-hand side of the console, and we're using hashtag #RetailerCollaboration for today's event. We hope you will too. So far in this series, you've learned about daily data sharing and actionable intelligence. We've discussed how to properly utilize alerts to improve in-store operations and on-shelf availability. Session 3 taught us how to create and execute against collaborative business processes with suppliers to overcome key challenges and meet your organizational goals. Now, in this fourth and final webinar, we bring it all together with a look at how to effectively scorecard your categories and suppliers, as well as incorporate that work into your joint business planning processes, the ultimate in collaboration and a new operational imperative. Key takeaways from this session include how to use scorecards to establish standardized reporting used by suppliers and across the enterprise, how to take your vendor collaboration program to the next level and properly track and measure its success. You'll also learn how to build a single version of the truth, multiply the number of resources focused on your business, maximize the value from your data, and build sustainable strategic partnerships based on common and mutually beneficial opportunities. Today's presenters will bring together the perfect combination of experience to address these topics. First, you'll hear from Jason Whitmer, President of Market Research at Cleveland Research. Then we'll have a presentation from Jennifer Beasley, General Manager of the Retail Team for Retail Solutions. After that, we'll have a panel discussion on key topics related to this issue and give you an opportunity to ask questions. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to Jason.
Thanks, Julie, and welcome everybody this afternoon to the last webinar in this series. I'm excited to talk through a couple things before I pass it over to Jennifer, and really there's 5 topics that I'd like to discuss as it relates to some key metrics and scoreboarding, both for the retailers and suppliers. But first, we're going to talk through what's most important for retailers and key metrics that we find most commonly measured in dashboards. Then secondly, we'll turn over and do the same thing for suppliers and talking through the top 5 most important metrics there. And then more importantly, what everybody cares about and try to find ways to connect the dots to where we can translate retailers' language and suppliers' language into one language, and what Julie just said, one version of the truth. Then we'll briefly talk through what we see as the most effective scorecards, and then conclude with a few actionable ideas as we see them that hopefully serves as a nice pivot point to pass it back to Jennifer. So first, let's talk through what we would see as the most important retail metrics. There's a handful of these, but it really starts with the top line in a couple different components. I wanted to break down what we would be watching as most significant and what most retailers watch usually daily, if not sometimes hourly in real time in these core metrics. But what's most considered the top item by far would be same-store sales metric, comparable sales. And that would be really broken down into 2 significant components. What is the traffic trending plus or minus? And then check, which also is broken down into 2 components with price and mix. We particularly like to spend a lot of effort and emphasis looking at traffic trends as the most organic figure of feet in the doors, and typically when that's moving in a positive direction, especially in the current retail environment, that generally means winning and gaining share. But sometimes there can be some positive deltas that can help within check, whether it's inflation-driven that's being passed through or more mix and price-driven, innovation-driven that's driving a check higher. Sometimes when you see both of these in the positive direction, there is a very healthy top line that also then flows through to the bottom line. Typically, it's the check growth that is more profitable than traffic, but also less sustainable than traffic. So we've seen various retailers or even restaurant trends, companies over time, really lean a little too heavily into check growth. And while that looks good cosmetically for the top line, it's just not sustainable over the long term without traffic growth. And so the more that check drives the ship, the more the tendency is to get out of balance, and all of a sudden you can find yourself priced out of the playing field. A good example of that over the last couple of years, maybe Panera Bread, a good growth brand with a lot of square footage growth, which we'll talk about in a second, but didn't have enough traffic growth, and it now has to retool their value equation to try to get more people into their restaurants. Secondly, would be square footage growth. That's fairly straightforward, but what's interesting, and we talked about this on a previous webinar, is that this used to be quite a bit of tailwind for everybody. There was capacity growth coming all over the place, new niche operators or category killers, or even just the mass market retailers. Everybody found square footage growth unless you had a supermarket tag next to your business, just straight up where there was a lot of encroachment in square footage. But this combined with same-store sales is effectively your top-line growth. When you combine the net new square footage plus same-store sales equals your revenue growth, but more importantly also within that square footage, which is the fourth item on here, there's an important metric to pay attention to with new store productivity. And all that means is at what rate of growth are your new stores opening to contribute to the overall sales growth. In other words, what is a normal and considered a good benchmark for a productive new store is that they come into the total fleet at about 75% the rate of mature stores. When you can see stores higher than that, 80%, even 90% or better, you're obviously hitting a sweet spot of not only good year one performance, but also some good flow through, some good profitability in all likelihood, where there's which really gets to this last item here, which is probably most important for those that are trying to work through their way through the profit and loss. I mean, is the store level contribution margin. In its simplicity, that's taken the gross profit and the gross margin rate minus the store level expenses as a rate of sales. And so when you get to a store level contribution, and not enough retailers probably spend enough time on this. I know a lot of restaurants do in this restaurant level margin, but what I would call store level contribution margin early on in the life cycle of a store tends to open up in the low single digits, but we can see these mature over 5 years plus into the double digit range. And when you're in the low teens for store level contribution margin, you have an incredibly profitable store. When you actually then have to leverage your G&A expense and everything else that would be non-store related. But that's an important metric to benchmark. And I would suggest benchmarking all of these not only for the total fleet, but also by class of stores. Whole Foods does that quite well, where they will measure same-store sales and their ultimate store-level contribution, or their net operating profit after tax, net NOPAT, for each of their classes of stores. And it's a helpful way to grade and score and measure the entire store fleet. Switching over to suppliers, it's a little bit different dashboard in terms of what's most important, as we've seen in development of a business or a brand. But it really starts with getting the brand on the shelf, and that would be sell-in, or that ACV, that overall distribution across all channels, all stores. Finding more stores and more segments to take the product and put it on the shelf is usually the first objective, and certainly having some good backing as far as pilots or other marketing opportunities, I'm sure will help with that. But once you get on the shelf, then it becomes gaining a greater share of shelf and better placement within the aisles, whether it's down the side counters or on the end caps or on the front end, anything that gives more visibility in the store. That yes, it can help with more distribution, but it's more importantly the actual share of a category, share of the placement that is watched and measured quite consistently. And then thirdly, how well is it being bought, that sell-through rate versus the sell-in. When that gets out of balance and all of a sudden there's excess inventory and it tends to come back onto suppliers, retailers do not like that at all in purchasing product that doesn't sell through. And usually the burden then falls on the supplier, especially when you start getting some non-food categories. that doesn't turn as fast, well, all of a sudden inventory sometimes is forced to be guaranteed by some retailers and some channels, and that comes back to suppliers. The fourth one on this list is just the base versus promotional mix, where we see the bulk of the business usually still sold on base, good 90% in a lot of categories, but over the last 5 years we've seen an increasing shift toward percentage sold on deal, and that's the promotional cadence that in some cases has been driven by a more fickle consumer or just the competitive environment that's been driving this, and everybody's been bumping into each other. And so we've seen some retailers, whether it be by their pricing strategy or suppliers in their pricing strategy, all of a sudden this gets out of balance, and either the everyday price is too high or the promotional price is too low, and all of a sudden there's too much sold on deal, and that leads to an unprofitable equation for both suppliers and for retailers, which gets to this last point. What's the real ROI on the trade spend, on the promotional efforts or other things and the cost of getting the product into the stores with better shelf, with better sell-through, and all the things included? We realize this is often measured differently by a lot of suppliers, and certainly the retailers and how they look at it also measured differently. And sometimes it's a theoretical number, sometimes it's an actual number, but this is something that is obviously very important to get a good return on all the investments for both suppliers and the retailers, which is a good transition point to what everybody cares about. And this is just a way to, if you're to focus on how to grow or where to grow or what is most important in growth, there are 6 items we list on this slide. It really starts with growing the category. That's a good win-win, if you will, and this is a language that unfortunately we don't see enough with retailers and suppliers collaborating together and having the same objectives to win on both sides of the coin. This used to be exactly what Walmart was all about 10 years ago and 20 years ago for sure. When they got into the project impact phase, it became Walmart holding out their hand, asking for money, and people paid it for the most part, but it wasn't a win-win, and that was not sustainable either, and Walmart learned that the hard way. But to grow the categories first, to grow market share second, and everybody wants to grow their share, hopefully have a growing pie. Third, to grow kind of consumer engagement and interest, which also includes, fourth, growing awareness. From the other side of things, for the consumer to actually have hopefully more spending power and discretionary purchases and just have more dollars to spend. That's been certainly a macro headwind over the last couple of years. It has not gotten much better, as much as the macro headlines in theory make it look like it should be getting better. The actual spending power and the real differential here is not the unemployment headlines or the jobs that are out there, but it's more the wages and the actual spending power left over when there's been a lot of extra cost burdens on consumers over the last few years, and especially at the mid to low end consumer. But the last one then is, again, I briefly mentioned this, let's grow this business together, grow the pie, and that makes everybody be able to win together. So those are some things that are more common languages. There are fewer benchmarks for all of that, and sometimes knowing the addressable market is uncertain. Knowing kind of the share levels can be, people may use different denominators or different measurements to get there. Knowing even kind of where we're at with the category and what's most important for moving the category can be different languages. So we want to talk through maybe a few different scorecards that might be a good starting point for having those discussions, that whether it's a supplier coming to the table or the retailer looking at their data. Here's the data, or at least the measurement of data that we think would be most significant for everybody. This is a little more higher level, not specific categories to look at, but if we were to look at 3 areas, these are the 3 that I would try to build some data sets on. 1 would be time series, 2 would be able to segment it, and 3, we're a big fan of benchmarking data. But first on the time series, we really like having a long time frame, especially when you can remove all the anomalies of the pluses and the minuses. So sometimes this takes rolling the data over a 3-month time frame, or rolling 12 months, or having full quarters, even full years sometimes. Definitely there's more. I think suppliers look more in full years, and retailers think about usually weekly, if not daily, inflections. But to have kind of more of a seamless data trend where you can more easily spot inflections. And we really like to benchmark 2 big ones. What does a business look like versus trend, and what does a business look like versus plan? And when you can find inflections on both of those, we think that's a significant thing in the business to look at, whether you're a supplier or a retailer. And certainly if it's on the plus side, rally behind that, and we'll talk about that as an actionable idea. But if there's something that goes wrong versus trend or is not meeting plan, that is a clear alert, and we had one of the webinars just focusing on alerts, but that to me would be a significant red flag to really dive deep into. Secondly, if you're to carve out data, and I realize you can carve data 100 different ways, In fact, you can probably have analysis by paralysis with some of this work, but here are the segmentations that we would look at both by product and category. A lot of people already do that, but we would focus on things that matter most, and then the needle movers in the categories. We'll talk about that on our last slide. But I'm a big believer in segmenting the business by customer mix or by regional mix or some other things that really stand out as the key differentials or drivers within your business. And again, if it's a retailer or customer mix, maybe demographically and understanding kind of who drives the show here, who you're really trying to target and segment. Also, to find outliers regionally is important at times, especially if there are extreme weather events or some other unusual regional variances, macro-driven. And sometimes you see that by the job rates that are highly different, both either by region and household income or even by ethnicity. These are some things to really dive deep into but not get too deep into. But lastly, I wanted to suggest benchmarking data and having a good baseline, whether it's your goal and the plan, whether it's a joint business plan or the retailer's plan or the supplier's plan. Know where exactly where you stand versus the goal at all times, but also how you would benchmark versus the market or some of the best-in-class, whether it be best-in-class retailers or best-in-class suppliers. Maybe they're not even in your field, and learning from others that you consider best-in-class and say, hey, that's something we want to raise the bar, that have kind of something we're attaining to. And we've seen Kroger have a really good best-in-class benchmark for each of their 4 keys. As a good example, they have a customer-first strategy where they've got 4 keys around price, people, shopping experience, and the environment and shopping products. And they're trying to make measured progress based upon those best-in-class operators in all of those. So again, they've got their own baseline. They see where the market's at and where they want to aim. Last slide before I pass it to Jennifer. Here are just 5 different actionable ideas that we'd want to share based on what we've learned and what we're seeing in the marketplace. We talked about win-win, but I would start and end with each meeting, whether it's supplier coming to the table or the retailer trying to focus on their own objectives. I would try to find the best win-win targets. What are we trying to accomplish? How are we going to get there? What can be a win for both of us? But then secondly, you can get buried in the details in doing that and the how. And so we would suggest not looking for those needles in a haystack, but look for the needle movers, things that really matter most. And sometimes there's only 2 of them. And I wouldn't focus on 10 of them. I'd focus on just a handful of significant needle movers and business drivers that either speak to that customer or speak to the current environment. 3, we think data can be a great point of leverage, certainly to chase things that are working or to correct things that are not. And so those hot trends are some real opportunities. The faster you can move on these, and data is a good enabler for that, or to really catch some of those empty shelves or things that are not working, either at an individual store or a collective group of stores or the underperforming 10% of stores. You can leverage data in a lot of different ways you probably couldn't in the past, and even mobile data or real-time data or crowdsourced data that can get you that data a little bit more efficiently and effectively. Number 4, we know there are a lot of scorecards, a lot of metrics. We would focus on fewer but bigger and better. And so these things can be much more powerful and engaging and maybe even easier to digest for both parties, for both retailers and suppliers and any other third parties in between. When you have fewer things to focus on, chances are it'll get knocked out of the park a little bit easier. Then lastly, if you can find ways to connect all this data with more of the qualitative, so this is more of the insights that can lead to real application and the how and what, what's next that can fit within a strategic framework for both sides. That's where data can become much more palatable, much more alive, and it's not just data for the sake of data, but it's connected with insights that can lead to much more dynamic opportunities to move the business forward. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jennifer, and she can go through her section.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I appreciate it. So much like you, we believe that scorecards are a big part of how a retailer can collaborate with their supplier community and help move the needle. So we're going to cover, how scorecards fit in overall collaboration. What are some of the best practices around scorecarding that we see successful retailers employ? We'll give you some examples, and then we'll also wrap up with some forward-looking expectations. But to start, we really believe that retailers are facing pressure from all sides to improve their performance, whether it's from Wall Street and specific metrics and shareholders for overall value, or even just competitive pressure and the changing consumer habits. We all know that the key to success for a retailer is that it's pretty simple. You increase sales, you decrease your costs, and you have satisfied customers. And to do that in today's environment, a retailer is going to have to leverage collaborations with their suppliers. Working together to improve can only help both the bottom and the top lines for the retailer, and we think that's going to be a key to future success. Today, we see retailers and suppliers are often not on the same page. They're not on the same state since reports come from different sources. They apply different filters, and oftentimes there simply isn't one version of the truth between the retailer and the supplier. And that should be a fundamental piece of the collaboration cycle. When we think about the collaboration cycle, we've showed this shot in a couple of our other webinars, but I really think it's key, so I wanted to show it again. There are a number of ways that retailers are collaborating, but the most successful ones are taking their couple of goals. So we believe also what Jay said, don't boil the ocean, pick a couple of very key goals, and then tie those to day-to-day execution, utilizing use cases and collaborating at an analyst and a very granular level with your supplier community, starting with joint business planning and adding in other services like store alerting. But ultimately, all of this needs to be measured by scorecarding. And without a baseline starting point of knowing where you're at, without consistently measuring throughout the year what progress is being made, and setting some goals so everyone has a universal point on the horizon that they're aiming for, it's very difficult to achieve the same amount of success. So we've created a couple of steps that we're going to walk through, and the first is creating a consistent measurement and monitor system. It's interesting. I oftentimes, when I sit down with retailers and suppliers, I hear that, gosh, sometimes category management is telling the supplier to focus on something, and supply chain is telling the supplier to do something else, and they're not in concert. And sometimes they're even in conflict. So as a retailer, having all of your departments aligned with goals that fit together is really quite key. And then utilizing the scorecards to help measure those goals is the most important piece of it. But it's not just about measuring the supplier. Scorecards are really key to measuring the overall category and subcategory performance, as well as store operational effectiveness. So we call that store DNA, and how effective is the store at various metrics that are really important to the overall success of the retailer. As part of this first step, having one version of the truth is an important piece. If you think about the way meetings often occur between the retailer and the supplier, the first few minutes or even half the meeting is often around whose report are we going to use, because the supplier has one version and the retailer has another. Where you set a consistent scorecard that you provide to a wide supplier base, it eliminates a lot of that discussion and time and makes you more productive. It also allows you to set and measure the goals throughout the year. And as things change, which we know that things always change, it also allows you to move the needle in an effective way. The next step that we have that we want to show you is actually some examples of what these could look like. We see best-in-class retailers sharing almost a variety of scorecards and slicing and dicing them different ways, but consistent ways. So whether it's by period or by vendor number, or even by category, subcategory, or by store or DC, utilizing the consistent metrics and having the same type of feel of scorecard is really important. We also see some retailers even add some extra tabs or looks, if you will, by department. So perhaps within supply chain there are some extra metrics that need to be incorporated, such as reclaim or waste or on-time deliveries. And then perhaps the category merchandising folks need another metric around maybe trade funds or some sort of vendor performance. But ultimately, having one cohesive place for those scorecards being produced in a consistent manner is what will make you successful. And from those scorecards, it's important to set some goals. We think that 2 or 3 goals is really quite enough to set for a year, and any more than that becomes a bit of a distraction for both your own retailer associates as well as the supplier teams. Some examples of where we've seen successful goal setting include things like increasing sales across the board or even more in underperforming categories, improving ad performance, and there are all sorts of metrics that you can identify for specifically ad performance. And then we also see a lot of metrics and a lot of goals being incorporated right now around reducing inventory carrying costs, as everyone is trying to improve on shelf availability without producing excess inventory. It's a pretty universal situation right now. Then we also see a use of scorecards with joint business planning. Ultimately, if you take your goals as a retailer and you pass those goals to your most strategic supplier partners, and then you measure them, that's the heart of what this is really about. And then monitoring the progress throughout the year across your key functional areas becomes a part of your culture, and that's where we see the needle really moving. This is an example of what joint business planning could look like. Clearly, it incorporates a scorecard. It also incorporates verbiage around specific goals for that particular supplier and monitoring capabilities, and measuring it throughout the year and tying those metrics into the specific scorecard are the aim. The next step that we see as important in this process is driving discipline of measurement and documentation. So oftentimes, suppliers are working on things on behalf of the retailer, and maybe a replenishment analyst knows about it, or maybe the pricing group knows about it. But where it's not documented and kept in some sort of central repository so that you can track return on investment, you're really missing out. In addition to that, where those goals are not being tied to the scorecard, you're doubly missing out. So some examples of how that might work within supply chain. Let's say you've gone through a category reset, and category has decided to implement some new items, which requires, of course, the rundown and elimination of other items. Making sure that we are documenting and effectively running down those items without producing very much reclaim or waste. And then also documenting what is our new item success rate. How quickly did we get those items to every store that was authorized? And then how did we most effectively change the allocations or the forecasts for those new items if indeed we might have gotten the item clone incorrect, or maybe the item was even hotter than we expected. So keeping tabs on the data and keeping the ROI measurable and documentable is key. This is another example of what the scorecard could look like in a more granular level. So we often see that retailers want to include a variety of different filterable capabilities. They often want to score either their categories against other categories or even their suppliers against other suppliers using proprietary formulas. In addition to that, we see them ranking categories and suppliers in similar ways. We're also seeing the advent of metrics such as PO statistics, trade funds. There's a wide variety of metrics. I had one retailer a couple months ago give us a scorecard, and it literally had hundreds of metrics in an Excel spreadsheet that went as far as you could scroll. That's not really effective when you have that many metrics, so we think you should boil the metrics down into the most impactful ones and really keep those on notice for everyone. So in closing, again, we think it's really important to tie the retailer goals to your day-to-day execution. How are your associates working on their daily activities, and are they reporting back into what the goals are for the retailer? Data is honestly the most integral piece of that within a retailer. If you think about the main criteria, so from store operations and ensuring they have the right product on the shelves, to supply chain, working through the DCs to the stores, ensuring enough inventory is in the system, all the way to category management and buying, ensuring that we have the right product on the right shelves at the right price. So looking forward, and actually we already see a good bit of this today, is that suppliers are actually integrating this data upstream. So suppliers can now get upwards of 70 or 80% of their total U.S. activity, sales activity, through POS and inventory data. And what that does is it allows them to work upstream, and it helps them to determine how much product should they be making, how many labels should they be making. So when we do have high demand, that they are ready to go and that they don't waste product or eliminate some of the code life of product, and that we all get the freshest product available. So where retailers are not sharing that data, they're going to be at a disadvantage. We also see that retailers are starting to much more effectively integrate online retailer data, so online sales, with brick and mortar. And omni-channel is a big buzzword right now. And data for omni has been very difficult. Sometimes a retailer reports online sales as a special store. Sometimes the hierarchies are different. The UPCs aren't consistent. But we see retailers working very hard to fix that and aligning the online data with brick and mortar data so that they can much more effectively use it. And then finally, those that lag or aren't sharing data or aren't fixing their omni-channel data are not going to be as successful as others. This is a inflection point in my view. We see a lot of retailers who are really accelerating how they're sharing data and what their expectations on suppliers are of what they do with the data. So now is the time to start working on it. So thank you very much, and I think we're going to take a few questions and answers.
Thanks, Jennifer. We're now, like you said, ready to begin our panel discussion. It looks like our first question is, how does the financial community grade good retailers, and what does this mean? Jason, do you want to address that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. At the end of the day, investors really just care about good financial performance, which is earnings growth relative to expectations, which is an important caveat. Certainly they like absolute growth, but if it's where it should be and as it is expected to be, usually that's already kind of factored into the value of certain companies, and what is graded as good is considered better than expected. But more than that, when you talk about what is considered a healthy rate of growth or healthy same-store sales, back to what I talked about before, it used to be mid-single digit same-store sales and better were considered best, because there used to be a point of sales leverage. That's just kind of a fancy term for saying at what point will your organic growth help you leverage your fixed costs where it becomes much more profitable and engaging in that flow-through on the profit and loss statement. But that used to be 4 to 5%. Now that these days it's probably more 2 to 3%. So the most significant way most retailers are graded is that same-store sales number, if not too much emphasis and focus is placed on that specific figure. But when you're if you're comping positively, but also doing that with positive traffic at a healthy rate, then the profitability equation from that really stands tall. Probably the best example right now of somebody that's really humming, one on the retail side would be Costco that actually just reported a 7% same-store sales number for this month, and generally they've been pushing what used to be 4 and 5% same-store sales numbers up to the 6s and 7s of late. Again, that's rewarded tremendously, and people really like that. In the restaurant business, it would be Chipotle that's actually pushing close to 20% same-store sales. You just don't see that as much as you used to, especially when most of that is driven by traffic. But that would probably be where it usually starts and ends, but it's got to be good top line without giving up or sacrificing or renting sales. Some people talk about it that way, where they promotionally drive their way to the top line and have no profits left over. But it's a good top line without being bought that has a good bottom line performance.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like this next question is for you as well. What retailer metrics are most important to the financial community, and how should the retailer tie them into their day-to-day operations?
So I answered the first part of that. The second part, in tying them then back into the so what of a day-to-day business. So the challenging part here, and this especially for senior management teams, is to not get overly hung up on the same-store sales number because the financial community does. I've seen some companies make some really poor decisions over the short term to try to chase that. Again, that's where renting sales comes into play, or making some irrational or emotional decisions, or things that are not sustainable. I really like how Kroger's outgoing CEO, Dave Dillon, said how if they feel like they did that over a short-term spike, and even if it worked and it spiked the business, that makes them sweat that much more the next year, because then they got to lap that. In fact, maybe we're even seeing that right now with Walmart. We've seen a little bit slower business in October, in part because last year they actually had a decent October where they were able to drive the business with some elevated merchandising activity around stock and save events, which I like seeing, but it's been proving difficult to lap that. And so to be able to effectively put both strategy to play that drives sustainable same-store sales, but not doing it at a rate that either compromises profits or proves difficult to lap the following year is probably how I'd best then zero that in on trying to operationalize that.
Mm-hmm. And then the next question is, what are retailers doing with scorecards today? Jennifer, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So I would say the average retailer today is producing some variation of scorecards, and oftentimes each department has a different scorecard. Maybe finance will have one, operations, categories, supply chain, and they all get used differently, and they're compiled in different ways, whereas best-in-class retailers are using one version of the truth, one cohesive scorecard, and they're giving it to suppliers on a monthly basis. Maybe not necessarily suppliers that they engage with on joint business planning, but a broader view of suppliers so they have a better understanding of how their business is doing.
Okay. And then how many suppliers are retailers scorecarding and JBPing with? Do you want to address that one, Jason?
Yeah, sure. I think this number has shifted a little bit over the years. It used to be just with a handful of suppliers and probably wasn't formally called a joint business partnership. But now that Walmart's done it and a few other retailers are starting to do it, I think they're trying to widen their lens, but I'm also seeing the more effective ones and kind of tighten it back down again. So many of them look at their first 100 or the top 100 suppliers as kind of that baseline of having some metrics and be able to kind of use that. And a lot of retailers sometimes leverage that against suppliers. So, hey, here's kind of the group, or here's your category, and here's where you stand within that category. Step it up a notch, either whether it's the top line or the margin contribution is typically how I see these things playing out. Again, that does not get back to the win-win scenario. That just becomes a point of leverage that retailers like to stand tall on. But where we see kind of more productive and real joint business planning, and some, for instance, are just getting into this, like Amazon is just getting into this. They never considered any real relationships with suppliers. It's all been data-driven, and still largely is, but they're having some more strategic discussions now than they've ever had in the past. But we've seen probably the top 25 really prove to be most effective as retailers really try to rub shoulders either with the biggest and the brightest, or even just those that are most effective and know how to not only effectively operate the business within their categories or within their larger departments, but also then how to strategically translate that. And we've seen some real effective advisory councils. Some retailers have built those or going back to the well with those. Or I just got back from a food service conference. I know it's not quite retail, but I've seen an interesting whole new collaboration effort from suppliers and a lot of restaurant operators, restaurant chains that are really trying to figure out to get to this one common language and having a process that it really is even top 21 operator talked about, and how that was just this year and piloting it. Next year when they really drill down a little bit deeper, they want to get incredibly deep with their top 10, maybe top 10 to 12. So there are real opportunities to get tight with your best suppliers. And again, it doesn't always have to be the biggest, but I would say the biggest and the best and the brightest is probably where I'd zone that in.
Okay, and then who within the retailer should own the scorecarding process?
Yeah, that's an important question certainly for retailers to consider. This has to be a top-down driven process versus category at a time for people to speak different languages or have different agendas within the merchandising organization or anybody else that has a bit of a say or a voice. But typically when I see senior management teams, especially, this usually starts or at least ends with CFOs that have their hands over all the numbers. So anytime numbers are involved, CFOs are usually involved. But I think if you can blend it with both the senior management teams where there's strategic objectives put at hand, and then probably the significant people from the operational teams would be in merchandising and supply chain, or the guys that are dealing with the operational side of it to actually get it done. That you need to have some cohesiveness in that and be able to benchmark and measure all the things that Jennifer talked about. But I think the top buy-in from the top is important as a first starting point, so that everybody can be speaking the same language. Because sometimes we see the best verbiage and the best wordsmithing from senior management, but if that's not well communicated internally and then flows through the organization, then it gets lost by the time either it gets to the merchants and the buyers, or certainly by the time it gets to the stores and actually get some of that stuff done.
Okay. And Jennifer, most retailers what tools are being used by retailers?
Sure. So when I sit down with retailers and talk about scorecarding and they show me what they're doing, a lot of them are doing it through Access databases or even Microsoft Excel. And those come from a variety of different feeds within the retailer, and oftentimes it looks like a spaghetti of different feeds and connections that feed both the scorecards and joint business planning templates. And it's often a very painful process for the retailer. There are opportunities and tools available on the market. RSI happens to have tools that are being utilized by folks like Ahold and Family Dollar today that allow for the dynamic use of software as a service in the cloud environment with drill-down capabilities and functional tools that are tailorable to each retailer. No matter what tool you use, it's really important that it's a consistent scorecard, that it's regularly produced in a normal cadence, and that it creates clear and critical next steps for actions that don't require a whole lot of analytical time. We prefer very visual scorecards that allow for the end user to be able to very easily determine what the state of the business is.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. The next question is anyone using scorecards to benchmark or score suppliers? Jennifer,
definitely.
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, definitely. We certainly see that retailers are using it to score themselves, first of all. So they're oftentimes scoring their own categories or subcategories to figure out what are our top performing areas and what are the areas where we might need to focus some more resources because they aren't quite at par. They're doing the same thing with suppliers. So whether it's a goal or a rank or both, they're walking through a particular proprietary formula, and it's a different formula for every retailer, but essentially it's some weighted formula based on the most important metrics, usually including things like sales, margin, number of new items, or some other even variable metric like how effective they are to work with. But these formulas are producing essentially supplier rankings. And those supplier rankings sometimes even feed awards such as Supplier of the Year or Most Improved Supplier. So we certainly see that as a trend happening today.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason and Jennifer, and to our audience for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. If you've missed any webinars in the series, you can watch them now in the Collaboration Forum. Simply visit www.retailercollaboration.com and go to the Media Room. We appreciate the time you took out of your day to attend today's session and look forward to your feedback, which you can email or send via the Q&A box. We will send a copy of this presentation along with the Q&A to all of our attendees. Thank you again for joining today's program and have a great rest of your day.